Welcome to American Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Rocking Mystery. He does the Rocking Mystery YouTube show and also rockingphilosophy.com. So, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. It's great to be here.
Thanks. And so today we're going to talk about the kind of definitions of right and left, because we're in an interesting state. When conservatives say right and left, they mean one thing. When liberals say right and left, they mean something totally different. And so in news articles and conversations, and you say, oh, I'm right, I'm left, the meanings are totally different depending on who you're talking to. And I know that you've done some videos on, their different definitions and also some of the origins of it, and I find them very interesting. And I think this is, if we're going to have real conversations in this world, we need to start talking this, if not talking the same language, understanding what people mean when they say something, First, we could start off on how do liberals and, say, conservatives differ. I know that you're in the UK, and so liberal and conservative has different meaning there, maybe truer to the original meaning. But how do the different views in terms of how people use them these days differ? What is the difference between them?
Well, first of all, I think the lack of clarity when it comes to left and right, I think, has been deliberately manufactured. Because if you actually look at the left and right paradigm at the moment, it basically is much the same when it comes down to how we define liberty and freedom. So we've ended up in this situation, based on where we are now, where you've got the far left being communism and the far right being fascism. Now, and then somewhere in the middle, you have, I suppose, some kind of centrism. But what's strange about a paradigm like that is that actually fascism and communism are both totalitarian ideologies. So if it's like a spectrum that goes from one extreme to another, it doesn't make sense. So it's actually ideological. It doesn't make sense why you would if there was a centrist position between fascism and communism, then that would mean that the centrist position would be a mixture between communism and fascism. So it's all very muddled, and
it's like you're trying to interpret all of society within the narrow boundaries of two very similar systems. Really,
absolutely.
Some people define them merely as nationalism or internationalism. In terms of corporate controls, they were a bit different, but really in terms of basic ideology and practice, they weren't really that much different, actually.
So they weren't. And the reason is because they're both collectivist ideologies.
That's right. That's something people miss, as was fascism. In fact, the very name fascism, the whole fasci, was a collectivist concept. Yeah, and it's a very narrow way of understanding the differences in people's opinions, because you're trying to suggest, or they're not you, but generally, people are trying to suggest that there's no views outside of, totalitarian regimes, basically, that you can't think outside of it, right?
Yeah, you can't think outside of collectivism. So this is where we start to get a bit of an idea of how this paradigm is completely unsuitable, because a second tier of understanding this would be putting collectivism on the left and individualism on the right. It's not perfect, but basically what you're saying is that all rights are kind of defined by the group on the left, and then all rights are belong to the individual on the right. So it starts to make more sense. But by doing that, then you put fascism and communism on the left, which upsets communists and fascists. But at the end of the day, if you look at fascism as an ideology, it is a form of national socialism. It's a form of nationalist socialism. So that's why the Nazis were called National Socialists. Nazi is short for National Socialist German Workers' Party in German. So it makes a lot more sense. It may upset a lot of people, but this is the political reality of trying to define things properly. So as you also said, you have internationalism and nationalism. So in a kind of, if you go back to the communism and fascism, communism on the left and fascism on the right way of describing it, you would put internationalism on the left and nationalism on the right. But once we get up to the next tier above, where things are explained far more suitably, we're having collectivism on the left and internationalism on the right makes a lot more sense.
And real fast on this too, we've seen a lot of communist regimes flip-flop between nationalism and internationalism anyways. The Chinese Communist Party is a great example of this. They promote nationalism when it suits their interests and internationalism when it suits their interests. The North Korean regime is internally very nationalist, externally very internationalist, and is absolutely communist in every way. The Soviet Union had nationalist internal policies and internationalist external policies under the global communist revolution. You see this under a lot of regimes. Under Ceausescu in Romania, also very similar, actually, to Mussolini's kind of cult of personality, as was Mao Zedong, but especially playing on the whole nationalism internally, but still fully a communist society. It in no way is a definition that could explain these things, and it's unfortunate people get caught in such a narrow definition, actually. But but on the scale even between, say, absolute government on the left and basically anarchy on the far right, which is what a lot of conservatives use, even that can't quite explain it, because if you understand even the origins of anarcho-communism and things like this, they believed, going back to these late 1700s, early 1800s, and of course leading up to the late 1800s, you even had a lot of anarchists fighting with the communist movements, on their sides. In fact, the bombing of Wall Street and a lot of the anarchist terrorist attacks were done under the kind of auspices of communist revolution, right? But anarchy, in its in its political sense, as it was applied during those times, was also communist, and they believed in practicing what they called personal anarchy to achieve what they called intentional communism. In other words, the communist goal of desolating a person's morals, values, recognition of hierarchy, recognition of tradition or concepts. The anarchist would destroy these things within themselves to achieve what they called intentional communism. And so we're still interpreting everything within a very narrow boundary of a very similar ideology. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So what libertarians tend to like the idea of putting totalitarianism on the left and anarchy on the right. But again, this just doesn't, it's not satisfactory, because we really need to get down to the crux of political thought, which is values and morality and rights. And on that basis, really, you need to basically think about where rights come from and what people believe in this sense. So traditionally, we've had absolutists who believe that rights are defined by might makes right. And they're usually, you would tend to place that on the left because of kind of more deep spiritual religious origins. And then on the right, you would say that on your rights come from God or from natural law, and they are above man.
The idea of might makes right, even though a lot of socialists might not recognize it, is the basis of socialism. Socialism, as many have explained, like Frederick Bastiat in The Law, is an exercise of government power. No socialist policy could exist without the exercise of government power. Even if you want to talk about free health care, what happens if I decide to not pay for it? Well, they're going to send people with guns to compel me to pay for it. The enforcement angle. Socialism cannot exist without enforcement, and it's through the enforcement that it becomes tyrannical. This is what differs from traditional generosity and state-sanctioned generosity, right? But sorry, you're saying that views differ.
I would continue then by talking about positive and negative rights as well. That's where things start to make a lot more sense. But before I get into that, did you want to add anything else?
No. You were explaining the idea of kind of this religious element also, that whether power extends from government or power extends from heaven, right? That's kind of
absolutely
what you're getting into.
Yeah. So you get, before we get to that point, I suppose you could talk about positive and negative right or liberty. So if you have positive rights, that means you can do anything for the furtherance of freedom or liberty, defined in a way that, say, in the way you want to. So communists believe it's acceptable to take away all private property, so because that increases the liberty of everybody, but in reality you're enslaving people. In like objective reality, it leads to enslavement. Now when you have negative rights, you realize that the only thing that's legitimate is protecting your natural freedoms, going back to natural law. So for example, your life is a natural right. You're born, but merely by existing, you're not oppressing anyone. So it's okay to protect that. So that's like the most obvious example of a natural right, and you can protect that through negative liberty.
Yeah, well, and this is an interesting point too. You mentioned the idea of slavery, and some people might not understand right off how socialism is a form of slavery. How do we define slavery? I would say the most basic, there are of course ideological and debt slavery and whatnot, but the most basic one is a person who works but who is not entitled to the fruits of their labor. The very basis of socialism is to seize the means of production, to make it so people are not entitled to the fruits of their labor. That is, by definition, slavery, right? The state seizes, a higher power seizes from you the fruits of your labor. You are not entitled to the fruits of your labor. A master state seizes that from you and then determines what you deserve of it based on their, how they decide to distribute it after, of course, filling their own pockets as much as they see fit. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a slave ultimately has all their labor controlled by someone else, and then that someone else, the master, then decides how much you get. Because even when slavery existed in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, the slaves still needed to be fed. But then that ties into the idea of taxation. Libertarians will often say that taxation is theft, but then communists will say that property is theft, to kind of have a kind of argument that they could use against that, if you like. But at the same, we're getting to a point now where things make a lot more sense, I think. But there is a religious dimension to this. It ties into many facets here, from the Bible to occult tradition, and you get like a left-hand path and a right-hand path. And when you're talking about left and right in this sense, people on the left-hand path want to put man over God, or natural law, if you like. And then on the right-hand path, man is under God and natural law. So that means natural law and God's law supersedes anything that man does, and that restrains man and society in the way that the United States Constitution would, which was heavily based on the philosophy of John Locke, which is why John Locke's philosophy is very compatible with the kind of positions I've been talking about here in relation to negative rights and, of course, natural law, which John Locke talked about in great depth.
This was also explained very clearly in the Declaration of Independence, which says man is created equal, and man is endowed with natural rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness in the classical education sense, like in Aristotle's Ethics, is very closely associated with virtue. So a person has the right to find happiness through the practice of virtue, right? But again, this is exactly what you're talking about, the idea that God-given natural rights, right? And so you're explaining that as more of the right-hand path of this system, correct?
Absolutely. And in the Bible, it talks about Christ being on the right hand of God. So this is quite an ancient tradition. But what happened in the 18th century is we had the Enlightenment, and then you had the French Revolution, and politics was framed then by having the monarchists on the right-hand side who were absolutists. They believe that the king just defines your rights because he has a divine right. So he actually acts like God on earth. And then on the left-hand side, you have the collectivists, the Rousseauians, and they basically believe that the collective has a general will and they can force you to be free. And that's ultimately what led to Robespierre's tyranny. And that in turn led to Napoleon, who was very much of the same mind, but had a more kind of nationalistic flavor.
Yeah, well, and that's a lot of forgotten history, unfortunately. You had ideological leaders such as Rousseau and Voltaire, who were, it's you know, it's hard to explain to people, I think, when they try to, you know, they read these funny writings and these guys have senses of humor. They don't understand that these concepts applied were very devastating, and really the Jacobin clubs and, you know, who Robespierre represented during the Reign of Terror applied these concepts, you know, to the T pretty much. And the result was the Reign of Terror. You had the, you know, with the requirement, what was it? Those who criticize us are themselves accused. Those who accuse us are themselves accused. If you were suspected of thinking against the state, you would be killed. They were taking people, you know, it wasn't just the guillotine and, you know, ankle deep in blood because it was running nonstop, which they saw as a very modern humanitarian way to kill people, right? You also, which is the most common image associated with the French Revolution, but you also had them taking peasants out and tying them together and, you know, shooting cannons at them with chains tied between them to cut them in half and things like that. And soldiers had a hard time with that because people didn't always die, and it was a very traumatic experience. And so they took them out on barges and sank the barges and things like this because they said, oh, well, it's the peasants hoarding the grain who are the real enemy. You know, it's them who are the real enemy of the intellectuals in the city, which is kind of ironic in the way these ideas developed. And you know, and they had very much this idea of enlightenment that, and of course they also had the whole cult of reason, which was an atheist cult, and you know, which went hand in hand with the de-Christianization movement. They were killing priests and these kinds of things, and putting prostitutes in the outfits of priests and setting them on, you know, in the churches and things like that, and bringing, you know, even Robespierre was horrified by the extent it had taken, which is why he started up a kind of conflicting cult called the cult of the Supreme Being, which was a deist cult. And it wasn't soon after that his friends in the Jacobin Club killed him. So, you know,
it's quite sinister because you start. I mean, the French Revolution was based on Illuminism, and of course, there is a connection between Illuminism and Lucifer being the light bearer, and this sort of thing, which is again goes down the occult route. And once you start to go down that road, you realize there's a lot more going on than mere politics. But I mean, at the end of the day, what you're dealing with here is the difference between objective morality, which is set in stone, and subjective morality, which isn't. Now, the left are inclined to think, oh, well, you know, it's really absolutist to say there are objective standards, but a kind of absolutist morality is based on the idea that might makes right. If you have the power, you can do whatever you want. But if you believe in objective morality, no matter how much power you have, you can't do certain things. And that's where the left just gets it completely wrong.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Illuminist ideas, and a lot of people, of course, they hear Illuminati and they think, you know, conspiracy theory, crazy, and all this stuff. But
they definitely did exist, though. That's a historical fact. The question is once they disbanded, whether they continued existing, of course.
Yeah, that was the Illuminati of Bavaria was the main one. There were other sects. It's unclear whether the other sects did anything political and weren't just ideological. But that was under. I can't remember his name now. But
yeah. I mean, I know there were other sects. They kind of embedded themselves into Freemasonry as well. So that's why a lot of people think that Illuminism continued. And certainly there's plenty of evidence of Illuminism when you see the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, where you have, of course, the all-seeing eye and things like and other symbolism that ties into the occult tradition of Illuminism, that kind of the Illuminati brought forward into European society and various revolutions that took place.
Well, there's an interesting writing by Leon Trotsky. It's in his autobiography, and he explains the origins of the communist revolution. And he says it originated in the Cercle Social, which came from and then to the Carbonari societies, which were revolutionary societies that had taken over the charcoal burner guilds, and then which was rooted in Illuminism, right? The Illuminati. And when people think the Illuminati, they you know, of course, they don't know what to think of it. They think it's this idea of celebrities making satanic symbols, and it relates to
Well, the
some
fact they're
global
doing it so
control
often
cult.
in just current society might be a bit of a clue in terms of the direction we're going down, but that's a whole other subject, I guess.
Yeah, but this is an interesting point, though, because it does tie into the nature of right and left in the occult sense. And it is important to note even the idea of enlightenment in the French interpretation of it, right? Lucifer being the light bringer, the morning star. And they like, the Luciferians like to compare him to Prometheus, the one who brought fire to man by sacrifice, and was punished for it by Zeus. They believe that by giving knowledge, by tempting Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge, that Lucifer brought a gift to mankind and was punished for it. So they compare Lucifer and Prometheus, and they talk about knowledge as being, this light. And so it's a cult of knowledge in that sense, and a very amoral cult of knowledge. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the ultimate source of all these traditions does tie into the Garden of Eden, and this idea of a garden and a tree with a serpent. This is a consistent theme throughout cultures around the world. But really what we're dealing with is this idea that the serpent is kind of a representation of enlightenment, light, enlightenment, Lucifer, sun worship as well. It all ties into the occult tradition, the left and right-hand path. And of course, by the time we got to the Enlightenment, it became a cult of reason, but where people thought they could take God out of society and still have a moral code. But it's basically been a complete and utter disaster. And this cult of reason kind of led to a counter-enlightenment, which pushed us even further down this kind of subjectivist route. And it led to complete and utter chaos, which actually ties into the occult tradition of left and right as well, because the left-hand path believe in order out of chaos, and the right-hand path is all about order over chaos.
It's very true. And just so we're clear, too, that, when we say enlightenment, this is different from the Eastern interpretations of enlightenment. The Eastern interpretations being, I think that when translated, they had the same word, but they were very much rooted in a belief in heaven and a clear, upright moral code. I think it's unfortunate that the name was used from the Enlightenment to define the Eastern translation of it. But this is interesting because so when we talk about, I think since we've gone down this road, but it's necessary when talking about the nature of the definitions of right and left as they are interpreted. And just to get beyond, I guess, just the limits of the Bible, this is not limited to Western systems. In fact, in ancient Greece, I think Plato wrote in his Republic about the dream of Scipio. And in the dream of Scipio, he's allowed to ride, he dies on the battlefield, and he's allowed to go and witness the reincarnation of souls. And he talks about how there were 4 paths, 2 going into and from heaven, and 2 going into and from the earth. The left-hand path was the one that led into hell, into the earth. The right-hand path was the one into heaven. And he talks about the beings coming out of these. It's a very interesting writing, actually.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting, actually. I think that's something worth exploring further.
Yeah, and even in the Eastern sense, the idea of yin and yang, they don't talk about right-hand path and left-hand path, but they talk about earth and heaven. Or, it applies to many different things, including earth and heaven. But the concept is that the 2 forces are in harmony. But yang, the heavenly energy, brings order to yin, the earthly energy. And they do talk about, the idea. So, for example, in the Jade Record, which talks about the beliefs of the Taoist levels of hell and the different courts of hell, similar to Dante's Inferno, it talks about how these are in the earth, actually, and explains every level and so on, and the punishment for sins and these kinds of things. And even in Dante's Inferno, we talk about into the earth and into heaven and these kinds of things. I'm just saying these beliefs go across many cultures, but when we're talking about the definitions of right-hand path and left-hand path in the English language, or I should say not just English but French also, but to say in Western civilization, this does have a very strong religious element. And so this does tie into, you mentioned the Bible of Jesus being on the right hand of God. and also, writings about the judgment, the end judgment, where all of humanity will be gathered before God, and he'll place on his right the sheep, I believe, and left the goats, right? And
Absolutely, yeah.
the sheep will
That's
be
definitely
granted
one part of
access
it.
to heaven and so on.
I
Yes.
mean, with the duality as well, there is a certain amount of distinction here, where the left-hand path would say that, there is no true like good or evil. It's a gray area. So, it's just, well, there is no good and evil. You just do what's necessary. But on the right-hand path, they make a very clear point of this is what's right and this is what's wrong. So people who are kind of strictly on the right-hand path would say that the idea of a balance between good and evil is quite dangerous, because how much evil is good enough to be, that would imply that just the right amount of evil is good when it's balanced by a good force, if you like, which is kind of like it ties into kind of a neutrality which you're trying to achieve. But people on the right-hand path, Christians as well, might say, well, evil is always immoral, regardless of how much it's counteracted by good.
Yeah, well, this ties into I think the belief in the Eastern system, which is yin is restrained by yang. That every person has desires, every person has evil qualities in them that could very easily go that direction if they so chose. But it is restraint that comes from a belief in morality and, at the very least, a conscience, right? That prevents you from indulging in those desires and things like that. And so this is the concept in the East of yang, the heavenly energy bringing order and restraint, to yin, the earthly energy, and how balance is maintained between them.
Yeah, and of course, the idea of good and evil, black and white, if you like, you often get that in occult traditions, like the checkerboard of Freemasonry. And this is a recurring theme you'll find often in popular culture now. They'll play around with the dualism of good and evil, where you'll get like black and white checkered imagery, for example. And of course, you have the all-seeing eye imagery and the pyramid imagery, but that's something that you might pick up more often if you're aware of it.
Yeah, so we were talking about some of the occult origins of communism. There's a few interesting points people should be aware of. One is that Hegel, right, and Engels were both Hermeticists. Many of the individuals around Marx were part of Gnostic systems. They were part of these, which had origins in Luciferian doctrine. One of the main threads of revolution in Europe was the Manichaeans. This comes under Mani, who I believe was a Persian. And the original heresy they promoted, and they were an anarchist revolutionary sect that was carrying out terrorist acts through hundreds of years in Europe. In fact, I think 200 or 300 years before the Inquisition started. Notably because they were trying to assassinate the nobility of Europe, But a lot of history is forgotten. But the basis of their idea, there were two different branches of it as far as I've traced it. One is this more satanic branch, which is, I think, even though I think in my understanding the Bible would say Lucifer and Satan are the same, that just different names.
I would say that as well. It's contested, but I mean, a lot of people in the occult tradition agree. But I often think it's a way of people who are more sympathetic to Satanism to kind of to muddy the waters. But Lucifer is the angel version of Satan before he fell to earth, and he eventually became this monster, if you like, in the form of Satan.
Yeah, and so from what I at least reading about this history, what I can understand in terms of what people believe. Right, and these are the beliefs of many people around Marx. Funny enough, so the Luciferian sect was more a cult of knowledge, and this tied into Illuminism and these kinds of things, and the various sects that involved Illuminism, including revolutionary societies leading up to the Illuminati of Bavaria, the Carbonari societies into the Jacobin clubs, and these kinds of things. The basis of this, it wasn't just a cult of knowledge, but it was also a belief in naturism. The Luciferian doctrine holds that the world is ruled by Lucifer. This is the domain of Lucifer, right? And that So it ties into this idea of naturism, right? Like the Cainites and these types of sects. And what they believed was that if nature itself is holy, as they understood it, right, then anything that emerges from nature is therefore righteous. So any whim you have, any desire you have, following that is therefore righteous because these are things that exist of nature. And by this interpretation of that's righteous, then anything that restrains that is unrighteous. And so morality, by their definition, is unrighteous. Organized religion is unrighteous. Government is unrighteous. Anything that acts, the father is unrighteous because he brings order in the family. Any kind of element that brings order, any kind of element that, at least moral order, any kind of element that tries to restrain absolute indulgence in basic animalistic instincts is unrighteous by their definition. And it's this concept of good is evil and evil is good. And it's funny that we see this playing out very heavily in communism and socialism.
In society, a wider society as well, it seems like morality is inverting.
Yeah, well, one of the first things one of the bases of Marx's concept of destruction and revolution is to destroy the divine hierarchy, as it was interpreted, which is the belief that there are many levels of heaven, God being at the top, through the levels of heaven, through the angels, or down to the kings of the human world, down to nobility, and so on, down to the father, down to the mother, down to the children, teachers, grandparents, village elders, you name it. That every level of society has a certain order to it, a moral order that draws its order from heaven. And so what does Marx do? He tells every single layer to rebel against the one above it. He tells people to hate God, to turn against religion, that it's the opiate of the masses and these kinds of things. He tells women to rebel against their husbands, for men to rebel against their bosses, for all people to overthrow their kings, for parents to struggle against the slavery of their family or their parents, right? That every level that creates this order, which in the Eastern sense we can understand is the yang element that restrains the yin element at every level, the father, the boss, the king, and so on, right? Every level that brings restraint or moral restraint is overthrown to create this new system of, absolute lack of morality, and where believing in morality is instead considered evil, which we saw in the Soviet Gulag system. We see today in the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of religions. That communism inverts good and evil and punishes those who believe in goodness, right, by its nature. And even in the West today, we see this with the forced moral relativism, where moral relativism is considered moral, and saying you don't like it or have different beliefs is considered immoral. So, people can indulge in whatever they want, and if you say you don't believe in that, then you're the bad guy, right?
Yeah, the only thing that's not acceptable today is not accepting absolutely anything and everything. If you say that you have any kind of moral standard, you are the enemy. So by extension, there is no real morality. But this inversion just ties into perpetual rebellion, which ties into the archetype of Satan himself, who rebelled against God, came to earth, and then decided to get Adam and Eve to rebel against their creator as well, as a kind of form of vengeance against God by destroying the morality and the innocence of the first man and the first woman. So it's just an endless cycle of rebellion, and to rebel, what you need to do, the best way to create constant rebellion is just constant inversion. So if it's good not to steal, then you make it good to steal. And then eventually what happens is you had to keep the cycle just doesn't end. Eventually you just get absolute chaos and everything is destroyed. Because if you don't have any order in society, everything completely falls apart, basically. So this is why Satanism and the left-hand path, as much as certain people or people who follow that path might think they're going to get order out of that chaos, unfortunately, chaos has a habit of just begetting more chaos.
Yeah, and we saw this as well. We see this as well with the communist idea of the eternal revolution. It is, eternal struggle, that struggle should always exist for the sake of maintaining the communist system, which is unfortunate that a lot of people who oppose communism, I think, get caught up in the surface level dialectical struggle of opposites that they try to get people stuck in. You look at groups like Antifa and the Proud Boys, and people who are just playing right into these systems. And at least as far as I'm concerned, that this struggle, they want you to fight on the streets. They want you to hate each other. They want you to be divided. They want you to hate your neighbor and to fight against your neighbor. This is the basis of communism. This is what it's about.
It's divide and conquer, just perpetual divide and conquer.
Yeah, and so the division of society into separate, into absolutely separate and independent molecules, right? The disintegration of society through an ideology. This also ties into the concept of dialectical materialism that Marx described, which he rewrote from the concept of Hegel's Hegelian dialectic. Dialectical materialism is a formula to manifest conflict, dialectical conflict. And so it's based on three principles of identify, contradict, and eliminate the middle. It's also a satanic principle, the use of internal inversion, right? So if we talk about, as defined in anthropology, for example, you have type 1 criminal magic and type 2 criminal magic. Type 1 criminal magic being ideologies introduced into societies that challenge the existing beliefs of that society. Christianity arising in the Roman Empire, causing issues with the Pharisees and these kinds of things was type 1 criminal magic.
Legalistic traditions, basically, where the law is above all. But who defines the law other than man? And again, you have man over God, because the Pharisees actually, they thought that they were above God with their legalism.
Yeah, and so the emergence of Christianity was an ideological challenge to that, and so it was criminalized, not because it was evil, but because, again, under that definition, type 1 criminal magic, it challenges the existing ideologies or moral systems of that country. This is different from type 2 criminal magic, which goes into intentional inversion within an existing ideology. And so within a culture or system, you invert the morals and use the morals to create a new system, or the inverted morals to create a new system. And this is the practice of evil as defined in most religions, that things that go against the morals of each society, which is the basis of Satanism, where they called God the demiurge and believed in, they believed that, I won't get into the whole beliefs, but they believed in basically committing all things forbidden by religion, murder, incest, you name it, because that was their act of carrying out their rebellion against it. That would be type 2 criminal magic. And what's interesting to note is that, and this ties into heresy as well, what differentiates a new religion from a heresy. A new religion is a new religion, separate in its beliefs and concepts of morals. A heresy is an inversion of an existing belief, one that takes it and flips it on its head and uses that inversion to create an evil system within that religion, not separate from it. And what's interesting in Marx is that he created a formula for creating heresy and type 2 criminal magic, depending on how you'd like to define it, which is manifesting movements through dialectical materialism, through strategic inversion. And this is why also communism is applied differently in every single country it's practiced in, is because the inversions of each society play out differently. The power structures of each society have their own, and morals and traditions of each society have their different opposites. And this is where I think a lot of communists and socialists get lost, is they don't understand how these systems relate to each other. Like, how does Maoism relate to Stalinism? How does Stalinism relate to Leninism? It's because they are inversions of systems within their times and within the society at that time. That they change, but the basis of them is the same, which is this inversion to manifest struggle, which ties into you talking about rebellion and the nature of rebellion.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, another way of describing this, because once you get into it, there are so many different facets and things that, I've kind of come across over the years, but what we're talking about as well is saying the ends justify the means, which is what people on the left-hand path believe. This is also called consequentialism. And what really ties this that ties us into what we started with and where we can go full circle, I suppose, is the Hegelian dialectic, which is very important in this regard. For Friedrich Hegel was the one who defined it, but you have a thesis and an antithesis. So you have two opposing sides. They rub off against one another, and then you get a synthesis. So when you think about the way politics is defined today, with fascism on the far right and communism on the far left, the purpose of that is that we get this hybrid system between fascism and communism, which really does appear to be where we're heading. You tend to get the cultural side of Marxism, of communism, and then you get the kind of economic fascism of corporatism and this top-down control of society economically through big business, who get favors from the government and act basically like feudal lords. And that's really that's why the dialectic is falsely framed like this, because they want to push out the moderates, the ones who are less radical, more rational, and generally moderate in their approach to things. So all you're left with is extremes, and you have to choose between two different extremes, because the people in the middle will eventually be forced to choose, or they'll be destroyed.
And this ties into, again, with dialectical materialism. One of the principles is eliminate the middle. Lenin called this was his sense of what he called partisanism. And the main line you mentioned, of course, the Hegelian dialectic, the main line that Marx borrowed from that to create dialectical materialism was Hegel's theory that conflict leads forward. And when applied to the ideas of social Darwinism and Marx's theories that society evolves, they believed that by manifesting conflict, by increasing the antagonisms in society, by driving people to struggle against each other, to fight against each other, to challenge, everything and destroy society from within, basically, that this would speed up as Marx believed it, evolution of society towards communism. And so they wanted to sharpen antagonisms between people. They wanted struggle, they wanted violence, they wanted starvation, which, of course, if you look at Lenin's, when he caused the famine, right? One of his famous lines is written in the Black Book of Communism, is that it will destroy not only their faith in the Tsar, but in God too, and will advance us more rapidly towards the next stage of socialism, because they're an agrarian society by Marxist definition. Of course, I don't believe that Marx was right in his theory of evolution of societies, because even by World War I, that theory had died. But it is important when understanding, when people talk about progressivism, they're talking about this dialectical evolution, this conflict, right? And the progress as they see it through inciting conflict in society towards the social evolution that Marx believed towards communism. And and this is the deeper subtleties behind language that goes right over a lot of people's heads, I think, but it's really important to understand when you look at how these people operate when it comes to how they create movements meant to agitate the morals of society or to turn people against each other, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this gets particularly interesting then when you start to realize that Marx had a lot of views that could be called satanic. He wrote a lot of poetry, and he even wrote the poems he wrote were very satanic in nature. They had a lot of satanic symbolism in them. But he also wrote a play called Ulanem, which is a lot like Game of Thrones today, where there were no real good guys or bad guys. Everyone was equally wicked and equally evil, and they would basically try to outdo one another to acquire power. And when you actually see Marx, when you see that side of Marx, you realize that all this chaos probably does have a spiritual dimension as well. And I suppose if you're being honest, when you really explore this subject, you will eventually get to this point. But unfortunately, we are, due to the secular world we now live in, everything has to be explained in purely political terms. But at a certain point, it becomes impossible to do that, because there are so many religious dimensions to this idea of left and right.
Well, and I would argue that communism functions like a religion. It functions more like an evil cult, actually, than a religion, in terms of how it controls people and dominates their choices in life and, forbids them from leaving once they're in it. And, especially if it holds power, that the way it steals from them, from their labor, the way it enslaves them, the way it functions, the way it dominates belief, the way it restricts belief, the way it controls thought. And it's very true that actually there was an interesting debate around the time of Marx. In fact, right before Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, there were a lot of different movements around them, and many, like I mentioned before, a lot of these groups were Luciferians. A lot of them were part of the Gnostic groups, and one of the main ones that was kind of challenging Marx at that time was the Church of Communism. And if you go and read their writings, it's super bizarre. It's kind of funny. They have all the normal functions of a church, but it has communist in front. So there's the communist hymns and the communist pope and the communist bishops, right? If you read it, it's a list of how a church works, but they just put communist at the front of every word. So it's almost funny. But when you get into their deeper things, and you can find this in books on, I think I read in a book on Austrian economics, a real thick one. But you're reading a very normal, modern, intellectual-sounding book, and then suddenly it quotes from their doctrine, and and the Church of Communism is saying that they believe in pushing for the final synthesis of God into Satan, and you're like, wow, what the heck do these people believe? And and they wanted to create a more openly satanic system to represent communism. Marx wanted a purely atheistic one. And if you ask me, it's because if you look back at the history of Manichaeanism, if you look back at the history of these different heresies that existed in Europe, if you look back at the Gnostic groups, a lot of them were already trying to push for that. A lot of them were already pushing for anarchy and moral relativism and destruction of values. And, of course, there was a Spanish Inquisition, people fighting back against them, and so it wouldn't have worked at that time to call yourself openly Satanist. But even more so that their efforts on that had failed up until then. It was not something people would just follow along with. But Marx, being someone who understood the idea, especially through the Hegelian dialectic of subverting processes in motion, right? Observing things in motion and changing the direction of them, understood that Darwinism and science and these kinds of things, which were developing in that time, could be subverted and used for this. And so that's why they created this atheistic concept of communism to run under. And it accomplished the same goals that the Satanists wanted, which was destruction of moral order, destruction of belief in God, destruction of hierarchy, the divine hierarchy and these kinds of things. And the formula Marx made to create it was based on satanic inversion as well. In his writings as well were based heavily in that same concept of strategic inversion. And so, whether we say Marx was religious or not, we can say the people around him very clearly believed in these things. And Marx very clearly invoked these things, whether he did so intentionally or not. But by doing so, he demonstrated an ability in it that many had tried up to that point and failed at.
I mean, the question really remains is whether Marx was sincerely satanic, or whether he and by extension being sincerely satanic, he realized that there was no way he could sell satanic ideology in a society that was still very much Christian. But as we move towards the kind of world we're living in now, where we've had, first of all, we had the Enlightenment, where we do have like this cult of illuminism that kind of pushed that forward, we realize that society is moving towards kind of absolute moral subjectivity. Everything feels and ticks the boxes of left-hand path, Luciferian / satanic dogma. So one must ask whether that was the plan all along, I suppose, or whether the logical conclusion of living in a society where you don't have objective morality is a form of Satanism in the end. You get this kind of these satanic Luciferian moral systems of just no morality at all, quite frankly.
I mean, and I think we're just a couple more minutes, and we'll wrap it up after this. But you know, this is an important point too. That when we talk about these things, it's not necessarily, you don't have to believe that these things exist. But what's important to note is that these people believed in this stuff. Not only did they believe in it, but they applied it. And the application of these things is a foundational part of modern political systems under socialism and communism, which has found its way into the culture and beliefs of Western, or the whole world at this point, not just Western society. And you know, I think this is important to recognize that, you know, you don't have to believe that Satan exists or the devil exists or any of these things, but historically you can trace the origins of these things, and it's a very clear lineage. This is the basis of it. Whether we choose to believe in that base, whether we choose to believe in the same beliefs is not that, you know, of what they are, maybe not follow their beliefs, of course, but to believe in the spiritual dimension or not, I should say, you know, is your choice. But historically, this is important history to understand when understanding the nature and origins of these modern systems. And I guess any last points you want to make on this? Any important points you think that people should take away when understanding this?
I mean, the main point would be that politics has been reframed between a false dialectic of two sides that are very similar at the end of the day. That is pushing us towards a point of continued totalitarianism, this hybrid system we currently live in, which is becoming increasingly totalitarian over time. But as well as that, I think this idea that we're going to have a secular society based on reason has completely failed. Whether that was the deliberate aim or not is another matter. But certainly it feels as though we've reached peak atheism in the West in many ways. I think people are becoming more religious, not necessarily Christian, although I do think there is a resurgence of Christian thought, which is growing significantly as time progresses and things get worse. But we also, on the other side of things, have this growth in kind of New Age spiritualism, which on the other end of the scale, I don't think absolute atheism, as Karl Marx envisaged, is remotely sustainable.
Yeah, great. Rocking Mystery. Everyone, please, you can check out his YouTube channel, Rocking Mystery, or his website, rockingphilosophy.com. Pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you again for having me.
And please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.